Sigmund Bloom is a co-owner of footballguys.com. He hosts the Audible podcast, and you've probably heard his soothing voice on the couch as well. He's an outside-the-box thinker, a fellow Yinzer, and to many, he's their favorite fantasy football uncle. These are his late-round perspectives. Well, I was up in Pittsburgh this past week. It was great. Like, for those of you who aren't aware, Sig and I both have that in common, that we're both Yinzers. We both grew up in Pittsburgh, but we're not in Pittsburgh anymore. I don't know how often do you get back there?
I haven't been back to Pittsburgh for a long time. I
Yeah.
don't have a lot of tight connections to the family left back there,
Yeah.
but in my heart, always a connection.
Yeah, exactly. So I haven't been back. It's probably been a 2.5 year. I mean, it's basically actually more because it was since the pandemic started and maybe a year into the pandemic. But, we were there for my sister-in-law's wedding, and it was the first time that my daughter was old enough to be able to like experience Pittsburgh and see Pittsburgh. Like we went up the incline and we went to the Cathedral of Learning, and like we just went to the Science Center. We did all of the Pittsburgh Yinzer things, went to Permanis, all that good stuff. So that was really, really fun. But the one thing that's just was so evident, every time I go back home, I turn on Pittsburgh sports radio because there's nothing quite like Pittsburgh radio in general, but Pittsburgh sports radio, there's this weird pessimism within Pittsburgh, with Pittsburgh fans and with Pittsburgh sports, despite the fact that the Steelers and Penguins have been two of the most successful franchises over the last, the Steelers arguably the most successful franchise in all of football. The Penguins over the last, 2 decades have been great. The Pirates, that's a separate story, but yeah, right. It's just crazy how pessimistic, the fans are when they call in and the radio hosts are, just generally speaking, whenever they're talking. But the one thing where there was this insane optimism was with George Pickens. They love George Pickens. And it's crazy because usually, to me, stylistically, those kinds of players are almost more hyped up in like the fantasy world because we get super enamored with those insane catches and such, and we see the upside and what could come. But Pittsburgh media, the fan base, they are in on George Pickens. And if he's not Randy Moss, I feel like it's a huge failure at this point. So I want to ask you the first football related question here.
Sure.
Where are you at with Pickens? Do you think that he is a decent pick at cost? Is there any hesitation for you with the way that sort of his route tree looked last year, where he's basically running a bunch of nines and just getting vertical? Is there any hesitation with you from that perspective, especially when you look at, what else is in this Pittsburgh offense and what these other receivers can do?
Yeah, I think you're right to bring that up as a concern because his usage last year, or his application, was not good for fantasy, even though it might have had more tactical value for the Steelers, at least stretching the defense and giving them a real deep downfield outside the numbers threat. But you're hearing what you want to hear if you want to be in on Pickens, that he's expanded his route tree, that he's doing a lot more. And the problem is with optimism, JJ, it's just the whole Steelers offense, right?
Yeah.
The whole Steelers offense. It sounds like, well, and of course, as long as Matt Canada isn't the obstacle to this hitting some sort of new level, right? Because Dan Moore has been better than Broderick Jones, which isn't necessarily a bad thing to comment on how Jones is doing, but the Steelers have a left tackle that they want to be playing, not one they have to be playing. That's a plus. Their interior offensive line is good. Deontay Johnson has been the subject of good reports. Allen Robinson, if you listen to the reports, has earned a role. He's doing what they expected him to do, not be old Allen Robinson. Pat Freiermuth, Darnell Washington's going to figure in to the red zone packages. Jaylen Warren looks ready. Everything is pointing up. Kenny Pickett put on muscle and is taking everything seriously, right? Like everything is pointing up. So I think we're going to see a better offense. We're not going to see a basement level offense in terms of productivity and efficiency. But week to week, I wonder if this is going to be a difficult offense to project. And I still think that George Pickens it could be just a rotation. Some weeks he may be 3 for 40. Some weeks he may be 5 for 130 and a touchdown. Now, over the course of the year, that may be good enough for like wide receiver 20 or 25 and make him look like a big hit. So I'm in on him in the sense that there's a tier of wide receivers, Sky Moore. You could argue like Elijah Moore, Gabe Davis, like 7th, 8th, 9th round guys. You're not taking them to count on them in week one. You know that you're taking them to hope that they become somebody you can count on every week, or at the very least, if you have to play them as your wide receiver 3 or flex, they can hit. They're still on the upslope side of their career arc. Kadarius Toney was in this tier. Maybe he still will be. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know what you're getting. And I think with Pickens, like I led with, if you wanted to be in on Pickens, everything we've heard this summer is what you wanted to hear.
Yeah. The thing with the Steelers offense that I found one of the most shocking statistics that I found over the offseason when just digging into stuff, as we know, the front half of last year, they had a really convenient bye week. It was week 9 last year, so it was like splitting the season in half essentially, right? And the front half of last year, they were horrific offensively. Probably the worst offense in football during the first 8 weeks of
Duck Hodges bad.
Yeah. Like it was really, really bad. And then the second half of the season, there were only 2 teams from week 10 to 18 that had a higher yards per drive rate than the Steelers. It was the Chiefs and the Lions. And so I think that we saw the optimistic side to what, the favorable side to what this offense could maybe be. They just didn't convert very well, in terms of touchdowns. They were kicking field goals more often. And that kind of stuff hopefully will play itself out and work itself out, especially as Kenny Pickett hopefully develops and becomes a better starter. But this is one of those offenses to me that we could end up, because we always want to target these offenses that just kind of come out of nowhere, that kind of rise and lift everyone in that system. This is one of those offenses. I think Washington's another one of those offenses where, we could see that happen. And maybe Green Bay too. And Atlanta. It all comes down to the quarterback position, right? It all comes down to, will Pickett do his thing? Will Sam Howell do his thing? Will Jordan Love do his thing? And the nice part from a fantasy perspective is a lot of this is sort of baked into their ADPs, right? Like you can get these talented guys like a Jahan Dotson or even like a Jaden Reed or something from Green Bay. You can get these guys at a very, very nice price. So I'm in on like buying into those offenses. And it sounds like you're cool with that too overall.
Yeah, that's why you can get Drake London. That's why you can get Christian Watson, a potential number 1 receivers. And like you said, it's baked in, right? Even Calvin Ridley in Jacksonville, in some ways, it's baked in. You're not drafting him as a top 10, top 12 receiver. So I think you're right. And I think you're right to always think about these things on an offense-wide level when we're trying to figure out the why, right? And it's funny. I was talking about this at the show. I just wound up with Scott Barrett, my show. Everyone's drafting right now, JJ, but I want to talk about the first few weeks of the season, right? Yeah. I'm already moved on 100%. To like week 2, week 3.
Yeah.
And the most important thing is going to be to just throw away everything we thought was true if the evidence in our face is telling us it's not true.
Yeah.
And then act accordingly. And I think you're absolutely right too. Look, even if you don't want to go in on Washington offensive line, we'll see Atlanta, Green Bay, Pittsburgh, some of these ascendant offenses, even ones that we're not giving enough positively. Maybe New England. It's not going to be New England. Maybe New England though. The other offenses where there's room to grow, there's room for them to get better, or at the very least, there's room for them to be better than expectations, like an Arizona or a Tennessee. So you just have to be ready to adjust and know that if you've incorporated into your range of outcomes for these players that, hey, we haven't really contemplated, well, what if the offense is actually, in NFL terms, okay, decent, functional, middle of the road? Be ready to react if that's what we see when the season starts.
Well, this plays into the idea that I know that you've preached for years and years. And I think that from my perspective as more of a data-driven analyst, we think more in terms of situation, probably a little bit more than what someone like you who's analyzing this game as a more of a, what are your eyes telling you? You're obviously still looking at data and whatnot, but like, I think that what you're driving at is that talent matters. And if situation changes, as long as you know the talent is there, that will give some player some sort of Drake London's a great example, because I know that we're both sort of bullish on the Atlanta Falcons offense this year, just in terms of like where these guys are being drafted. Kyle Pitts, Drake London, and these players, and Bijan being decent values and so on. The way that I see it is Drake London in particular. We know that Drake London's talented. I mean, you could look at what he did last year. You could look at his data. You could look at what you saw. We've already seen it in the preseason. That catch that he had this past week was amazing. Drake London looks to be like the real deal. And the reason that he's being drafted where he's being drafted right now is because purely of offensive situation and the market assuming that Atlanta is going to be a very run-heavy offense, right? And so from my perspective, if Drake London's a 4th-round pick, sometimes a 5th-round pick, especially in more casual leagues, if he's a 4th or 5th-round pick with the Falcons offense being a super, super run heavy offense, then it can't get any worse than that in terms of offensive situation, right? So the only direction that he can really go, hypothetically, maybe there's a little bit baked in, maybe there's a little bit in there where, he could go down a little bit, but realistically, if he were in an average offense, like you're saying, if the Falcons offense ends up being average, if their pass rate's like 20th in the league instead of, 30th in the league, then I think if we made that assumption entering the season, would he not be being drafted maybe right after Chris Olave, like in that range, right?
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, maybe his situation looks a lot more like Chris Olave's than we contemplated. It's a more narrow passing target tree.
Mm-hmm.
But, we talk about players being drafted at their ceiling. We don't talk as much about players being drafted at their floor or players where one of the things I like to do, JJ, always is look at last year's ADP. And we're talking about the hive mind. We're talking about the wisdom of the crowd, right? And we can make at least a starting point of this was the player's ADP last year. This is their ADP this year. Doesn't make sense.
Right.
What is the hive mind thinking, right? And I think we can look at a player like Drake London, who we know is going to be the number one wide receiver in his offense. And I guess a comparable downside guy. And this is also going to everything we say about Drake London applies to DJ Moore, right?
Yeah,
right.
Same
you
deal.
can just swap the two. You can swap the two players out in the analysis. We're already assuming, because I think Darnell Mooney was like a 5th round pick last year.
Yeah.
But Darnell Mooney, we remember Darnell Mooney, he got hurt before Justin Fields at least was kind of got the car to start and get out of the garage in the passing game a little bit. And we think of that, and DJ Moore we think of from Carolina. That's why everyone's staying away from Mike Evans. And Chris Godwin's ADP, even though he's coming off an ACL, I think he's about the same price as he was last year. So you just can ask yourself these questions. And with respect to Drake London or DJ Moore, the player that keeps coming back to my mind, JJ, is 2020. I think it was 2020 A.J. Brown. Second year A.J. Brown.
Yeah.
Where, don't tell me that a player can't be a wide receiver one with 100 targets. He did it. Now you can say A.J. Brown is really, really good, but do we know if Drake London is really, really good yet? He might be. He certainly is following the career arc of someone who's really, really good. And DJ Moore, we haven't quite gotten to see what he can do with a quarterback. Now, Justin Fields may or may not be that quarterback. That's the problem.
Yeah.
But like you said, all that uncertainty is already baked in. And Moore and London keep standing out to me as guys that if you're going to say, give me a name of someone who's not being drafted in the top 10 wide receivers, which is a hard bar to get above, that can end up there. Those two guys are at the top of the list.
Yeah, and the other thing too, I think more from like a game theory perspective, is that with wide receiver in particular, there's a more linear drop-off than what we're going to see at running back. And so when you get a wide receiver that just meets expectation as a wide receiver 2, that's okay. That's more okay than a running back. Like an RB2 meeting, and this is why the dead zone exists. This is why the running back dead zone has been a thing for so long, is that, we end up drafting these RB2s in a more linear fashion in our redraft leagues, when realistically an RB2 is not that much different than an RB3 and sometimes an RB4, just in terms of how they score points, right? And where they're being drafted ADP-wise. Whereas at wide receiver, a wide receiver 2 to a wide receiver 3 to a wide receiver 4, we do see this linear drop-off. Now, we might not see as big of a, if you have an elite running back, for instance, like the best running back in fantasy football, you're arguably going to get the biggest advantage that you could possibly get in fantasy, right? But I do think that, like, we often sort of misconstrue this idea of running backs and chasing ceiling at running back versus chasing ceiling at wide receiver. I think it's okay if you get a Deontay Johnson at wide receiver because he's someone that is going to provide. We know that he's likely going to be he was basically a wide receiver 3 last year without a single touchdown. We know that can still happen, and that's still usable at the wide receiver position. It's far less usable at the running back position. I think that's a really, really big distinction too.
Yeah, and to your point, JJ, running back after about the 10th running back this year, it's just perilous.
Yeah,
it's
flat.
It just feels like there are going to be hits, and let's take injury out of the picture, because of course there are going to be hits because of injury.
Yeah.
But just these uncertain splits, and the idea of we can go back to Pittsburgh and talk about Harrison and Warren. And one of the things I remember from the good old days back on Old Yeller, the Football Guys message board, which at one time, if folks who don't know about message boards, that was one of the hot spots on the interwebs to talk about fantasy football. Talent creates opportunity, with the asterisk of if there's a rationally coached team.
Right.
Talent creates opportunity. So there's so many of these splits, and it can go both ways, right? Like you can say talent creates opportunity as a reason to like Jalen Warren and fade Najee Harris. But you can say talent creates opportunity as a reason to stay on Ramondre Stevenson, even though Ezekiel Elliott got signed there, right? So like it can go both directions. Like the lack of talent can create opportunity or greater opportunity. But all of these running back splits are so uncertain, and I feel like more of them have gotten uncertain than have gotten certain over the last month.
So has this forced you, because we do an Apex draft, this Apex Writers League draft. This is like our 9th year doing it or something like that. I mean, it's been a while. It makes me feel very old, but we've been doing this thing year in and year out. And this year, you ended up getting Nick Chubb in round 2 in this draft, and you took him over Tony Pollard. Now you mentioned this like 10 or so running backs. I agree. I mean, I think, just given the uncertainty of like Jacobs and Jonathan Taylor too, it might even be, just shrinking.
7.
It's just, it's like there's like these 6 or 7 running backs that you feel okay about as your RB1. But my question is, so number 1, you took Chubb over Pollard. My first question would be, was that a difficult decision for you? But then the second question is, because of that clear drop off, like once you get into like the Najee Harris, Travis Etienne range, to me, that's where you start to just see this flatness at running back, where you could make the argument that someone like a Rachaad White, let's say, has just as much of a ceiling as those players do, just from strictly a pass catching standpoint, right?
Sure.
And so given we both agree there, are you then forcing yourself more so in the first 2 rounds, one of the first 2 rounds, depending on where your draft slot is, because I think it's a little bit more difficult in some parts of these drafts, but are you sort of trying to force yourself to get one of those running backs because then you get that anchor and you just feel better about it?
I think it's pretty clear that Chubb, Barkley, Pollard are probably, for team building purposes, better picks to give you more flexibility in your draft than the second-tier wide receivers, your Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams types. That's the choice you're going to be making. Or Mark Andrews. And if someone says, I'm taking Mark Andrews in the second round and no one's going to stop me, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong to do that. That could end up being brilliant. That could end up being one of the best moves you make in a fantasy draft. So I do think that getting one of those top 6, CMC, Eckler, I'll answer the other part of your question. But Bijan being the other one that we haven't mentioned. I do think getting one of those 6, and in a typical draft, Ian Harditz was pointing this out on my show a few months ago. Like in a typical year, JJ, those guys are the 6 of the first 8 off the board.
100%.
So you're not even thinking about that running back in the second round. That makes it a little easier to say, hey, in the second round, especially if you have a late first round pick and you're going to take an early second round pick, running back makes sense. So I was happy to get Chubb there in the second because it takes a lot of pressure off. And then Chubb versus Pollard was not quite as hard. I have to admit, I'm pretty excited about Chubb as a true workhorse.
Yeah,
Chubb as a guy. I don't know. Allure of unknown upside. I love unknown upside players. Pollard has it to an extent. Bijan Robinson. So I think that's really where the debate comes in for me, is like Bijan versus Chubb at the end of the first round. But and then we could also bring in Barkley. Barkley could be the rising tide lifts all ships if the Giants offense is just better.
Right.
Again, one of those offenses that come out of the basement.
Yeah.
That might trump all these things. But there's a bull case for all 4 of those guys. Now, here's I'll finish with this point. So that leaves you where you only have to hit one of these picks. But there are enough attractive guys like Dameon Pierce. I think Dameon Pierce in the 4th may look like a value real quick. Alexander Madison in the 5th may look like a value real quick. James Cook in the 6th might look like a value real quick. Khalil Herbert in the 8th. So if you say, you know what, I'm going to make sure I get 2 of these guys. What do they call it these days? The zero running back, whatever. It's not quite zero running back because you can't just slough the position.
Right.
You got to have targets. You got to have a plan. That plan can also work.
So why do you think the wide receivers are being drafted where they're being drafted? Like, do you think it's the best ball influence? Do you think it's the nerd influence? Do you think that it's because one thing I will say is last season, if you compare first and second round ADP from last year to this year, it's actually not like dramatically different in terms of the sum of the 2 rounds. What's a little bit different is just the front half of the first round. Like that's where we're seeing, like, again, you mentioned like the CMC Eckler, you mentioned where these Chubb and Pollard guys would be going, where CMC and Eckler are going, and CMC and Eckler historically would be like 1-2 type picks, right? They would be maybe Jefferson would be the 101, but then you'd get CMC and Eckler as 102, 103 almost consensus, but now you're getting Austin Eckler 108 sometimes, right? You're getting these players a lot later.
Right.
Do you think that there's a reason? Do you think that people were burned by running backs last year? And we see that every year where there's just this turnover in the way that people are approaching the early rounds based on what happened the previous season. Do you think it's best ball that's influencing it? Because obviously, some platforms are incredibly skewed wide receiver. Or do you think that this is the way that they should have been drafting all along?
Right. Probably some of that last option. Some of that last option, which goes hand in hand with zero running back, do the opposite, upside down. It's been around for a while. I mean, going back to the original days of stud running back 20 plus years ago, that's where Paul Charchi and Matt Waldman come up with this idea. Well, if everybody's taking running backs early, how about try a strategy where you don't take a running back early? And it's risen. And I think part of what informs that is when you get to the fantasy playoffs and a team with Jerick McKinnon and Josh Jacobs is beating you over the head, even though you took running backs in the first and second round, that might stick with you.
Yeah.
And I think that the amount of uncertainty, and with the running back especially, I was come back fantasy football. I use this as a metaphor, but the Paris to Dakar race, where it's more important to actually finish the race than to have the fastest car. Like you just have to keep the car on the road and keep going. And I think backfields can be like that too. So the backfields and running backs we're choosing from, and the state they're in, the health they're in, the productivity changes. So by the time we get to December, it's not the same, right? There's wear and tear. And I think that sticks with people. And then I also think it's just running back by committee continues to become, what it's dovetailing with, JJ? It's the depressed running back market.
Yeah.
So teams don't need to pay that guy. They don't need to use a guy that way. I think there was a time, again, I'm an old man, when we were telling people running back by committee's coming. I think Bill Belichick was out there in the horse riding the front of the herd. And now that's the default. And a running back like a Bijan, even Jahmyr Gibbs, who went 12th overall, is still a committee running back.
Right.
So I think it's just those days are over, which makes those guys more valuable. But also the way things go with running backs is, what do you have at the beginning of the end of the year, what you had at the beginning of the year? I think it's got people a little freaked out taking running backs early.
So with late round perspectives, I took, a little bit of my experience coming on the couch for so long, right?
Yeah.
And I just want to have, and this is why you're the perfect first guest for this show, because you've been doing on the couch for so many years, and it's this casual sit down, like you're there with us type of show. And that's really what I want with this at the end of the day. And so I want to really build off of some of the things that you said so that people are, we're following up, we're asking those proper questions, because as people are listening, they're probably thinking these things. One of the things that you said and what you talked about surrounded Alexander Mattison. Okay? Yeah. So Mattison to me is easily the most interesting player, I think, in fantasy football this year, because on one side, and here's the thing, you'll be shocked to learn that I'm somewhere in the middle, but on one side with Mattison, you can see the potential. There's really not that much in the backfield. I don't mind Ty Chandler as an option back there. I think that he's got some burst. He comped really well for me to Elijah Mitchell when he came out last year. So I do think that he has sort of that like 1B in his range of outcomes, in this offense. But with that being said, it's very easy to recognize that there's not that much competition in that backfield. Maybe they're a candidate to get a Leonard Fournette or something like that, but there's not that much competition going on in Minnesota, right? And so that's the clear upside with Alexander Mattison, is that he finally has his shot. Is this going to be the year where he's just a complete workhorse in that offense? Now, the downside is that, my analytical brain goes back and looks at my spreadsheets and looks at what's happened historically. And these like year 5 guys who haven't done anything throughout their career, we really haven't seen this big breakout from one of those players before. It just has not happened. His comp list is not good at all, right? So I want to understand, right now, because there's so many people that only see that negative side, I'm actually at market with Alexander Mattison. Like I'm right there because I'm still recognizing the lack of competition side, all of that, yada, yada, yada. But at the same time, I do recognize the downside here, that he might not be that good and that he wasn't seeing work. Yeah, he was playing with Dalvin Cook, but there are other players that were buried behind studs that still got, Tony Pollard is a good example of that. Playing with Zeke is still getting work because he's that good of a player, right? And so Madison was only getting that work when Dalvin Cook was out. So I'm curious, what is it that you see with Madison? Like, have you been drafting him heavily? Is this one of your targets this year?
No, I'm a kind of a Johnny come lately
Okay.
to the Madison party.
Okay.
I'll tell you one key thing. There was a piece The Athletic put out today. I can't remember. Is it Chad Graff? I don't want to say someone I don't remember exactly. He might be covering New England by now. My brain. But the Vikings, they were asking for a fantasy football tidbit from the summer from each beat writer. And the Minnesota beat writer said something to the effect of, hey, Alexander Madison has caught passes out of the backfield in multiple concepts. Remember this. A lot of camps, and I don't know if Minnesota has this as a strict policy, you're not allowed to talk about things. Cecil always brings this up about Denver. He's not allowed to talk about something unless the coaches talk about it.
Yeah.
He can't say, hey, this is what's going on. He'll every now and then do this really fun thing and be like, if you were to have maybe been there, and you might ask me, did I see? And, put it in a pure hypothetical. So it's not like he's saying he saw it. Wink, wink. But I wonder if that's one of those situations where, hey, they're prepping Madison as a true every down workhorse, which the lack of personnel moves would be consistent with.
Right.
And we're just not totally privy to that except by little things dropped in like that Alexander Madison, because what are we just talking about? All these ambiguous backfields. What's the split going to be? Who's going to be the better running back? Is it going to change? Is it going to be fluid? This one might just be Alexander Madison's show. And to your point about what's the comp of a fifth-year breakout that had these numbers coming in, I think that's kind of a dynasty versus redraft take, right? I think from a dynasty perspective, that means he's a sell. Just play the percentages and sell him.
Yeah.
But from a redraft perspective, we only care about this year. And we might even really only care about, like, if it's a zero running back strategy, just get me out of the gate. Just get me to week 7 or 8, 6-1. And then but the whole point of zero running back is you keep changing and upgrading and flowing with the way the running back position is chaotic over the course of the season. Now, the other thing that I would say is let's see going forward is in a running back market where everybody wants to be more frugal than everybody else. In 10 years ago, Dalvin Cook would still be a Viking, right?
Right.
This would still be a split backfield, which kind of speaks to your point, but also it might mean that running backs are going to get, at least for a year, a greater opportunity than similar running backs would have earned in the past because teams were willing to pay up for running backs.
That's a great point. That is a fantastic point. That is not something I thought about, really. With regards to things that we were just talking about, how the NFL right now is in this place where they're not paying up, and that has this trickle down effect because these teams then are saying, oh, we don't need to give this guy the bulk of the work because we're not that invested in this guy. It doesn't matter that much.
And he wants $6 million.
Yeah, right. And
no.
So now, yeah, I mean, it does make sense though, that point that, historically, maybe those comps don't hold as much weight because this is a different era in the way that teams are approaching the running back position. That's a very good point.
We'll see, right?
We'll
and
see.
I mean, and isn't that why I always go back to that Klosterman piece because people will say, why football? Like, why? And I'm obsessed with, everything I like, I kind of end up obsessed with for some period of time. But obviously we dove into the deep end, JJ, with football. And he wrote a piece, I think it was on ESPN's blog. I brought this up a bunch of times. ESPN used to actually have a cool sports blog. Hunter Thompson wrote for it. And it was an excerpt, I think it was in his book, Walking the Dinosaur, but he talked about how progressive football is as a game, that it's always changing. That's copycat league and so on. It's always a moving target. It's always changing. And because of that, and this comes back to something I know, and I'm presenting the other perspective, right?
That's it. That's
outliers, right. Like it's on one hand, you shouldn't try to predict outliers. And people like you and Mike Clay, who I got to have back on the couch again for the first time in a while.
Nice,
love Mike.
Nice.
Like fantasy football as an endeavor where you just stack 55, 45 bets, that works.
Mm-hmm.
And the data can give us your list of 55, 45 bets and just stack them up.
Yep.
However, in something like fantasy football, where you're looking for the championship, right? Or even like high stakes leagues, where you're trying to be the best out of 1,000 teams and not just 12 teams. Now outliers become more important. And outliers, I would say, win championships. Outliers are the players that are the difference. And even though we say it's hard to predict outliers, it's hard to find outliers, we fool ourselves into thinking we can see outliers coming. I do think the data can show us some of the indicators that give us at least a list of, if there's an outlier, it's going to come from this list, either based on the offense or who knows what. And I think that you still have to try.
Yeah.
You still have to stick your neck out and try to identify the outliers. And most importantly, once we see the first few chapters being written that this player might be an outlier, be ready to get on board early. Put it on even someone like Odell Beckham in his rookie year, even though he had the hamstring injury and didn't start until late. Everything we had heard about him before he got hurt was wow. Just Zay Flowers, I think, is a good example. Because Zay Flowers catches as many balls as peak Keenan Allen. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Be open to these outliers being possible, because a few of them the ships are going to come in.
I think the thing that changed for me the most over the last decade or so in doing this, because I definitely started everything in my career in playing things pretty conservatively. I mean, we played in probably 50 to 60 leagues together through the years, but I definitely have evolved in terms of the way that I approach players like Christian Watson, right? Christian Watson is one of my highest rostered players this season because of what you're talking about, where you can easily talk yourself out of out of Watson based on the negatives, based on Jordan Love, based on the fact that, he didn't really see that high of a target share consistently in that offense last year, based on the fact that he was a 4-year wide receiver at a small school who wasn't, the most polished prospect in the world. But to me, it's more about looking at, and this is where I think Dynasty and playing Dynasty can really help people understand investment in fantasy football, where in redraft, and this sort of goes to what you're talking about with Alexander Madison, in redraft, your opportunity cost in getting players after round 3 is just not very significant. The hit rates when you get to round 4, round 5, round 6, people would be shocked by how bad the hit rates are, with a lot of those players. So you might as well just sort of shoot for the moon and just go for it with a lot of these guys. And so, it's different than, last season's a really good example of this too, where I was okay enough with drafting Gabe Davis last year in redraft, but I was not okay in investing in Gabe Davis in Dynasty. And I got feedback from people saying, well, this doesn't make any sense because Gabe Davis is a 3rd-year wide receiver. You should be going after younger wide receivers in Dynasty. But the cost to acquire is totally different in these two formats. It's a totally different game. A really good example of that this year with me is Rashee Rice, who I didn't think Rashee Rice was a good prospect. I did not love him, coming out. He's, again, analytically, 4-year wide receiver, non-Power 5 school, doesn't really produce until his senior season. Those are the kinds of flags analytically that can really, that scream bust, right? But from a redraft perspective, it's a depth chart that's climbable. There's really no one there on that depth chart that's scary. I mean, we can like Sky Moore, and maybe I know both of us are Richie James guys. I know that.
Yeah.
But there's players that we might like a little bit, but let's not pretend that Richie James or even a Justin Ross is a proven commodity, right? And so, given the fact that Rashee Rice, in Dynasty, you have to spend a mid-second round rookie pick on him, which is not insignificant. Whereas in redraft, you're just throwing that late round dart. If he doesn't work out, he doesn't work out. It doesn't matter at all. And so that's the way that I think people need to sort of flip that switch and think about, because oftentimes, and I bet you get this probably more than any other analyst, oftentimes people say, well, what about the downside? Well, what about this? Because you're obviously looking at it from the perspective of mostly upside. And like you're saying, upside is what wins championships at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the simplest way I can put it is, can you formulate the best case scenario for a player? We can talk about whether injury to other players should be part of that. It depends on the injury-prone nature, whether they are injury-prone. But just formulate what's the best case scenario for this player. And then we can go a second level and say, based on the data we have so far, based on the information we have, soft information, hard information, are we on one of those paths to that best case scenario? And that should basically, like you said, dictate your draft pretty much from the 5th or 6th round on, and or even the 3rd round on. Even if you want to say, hey, I'm taking Jonathan Taylor in the 3rd round because exactly what you're talking about. Because it's not, because I can envision him getting traded to Miami and running for 1,700 yards.
Yeah, being the RB2 in fantasy. Yeah.
Right. I can envision that. So, and then furthermore, using Taylor's example, now we have a new piece of information that he's going to ask for his trade. He's asking for a trade and being given permission to seek it. That's new. And that Miami is the team that keeps coming up, right?
Yeah.
So you can say, well, now I can see we're 2 steps of the way. Maybe it's 10 steps to get there, but at least we're a step or 2 down the path.
Yeah.
And that's it. And the other part is I'll cite Matt Waldman, who's he's a true sage. in our field, where he says the draft is just one leg of the table. There's lineup setting, there's waiver wires moves, and there's trades. So when people say, "What about the downside?" Well, that's what those other legs are for.
Yeah.
That's what, that's
Yeah.
that's what the other, and that's why, like I said, even though everyone's drafting and we're giving draft advice, and I'm writing up all my draft advice stuff, I'm hot and heavy in it. I'm already thinking about the next step, which is that reaction in the first few weeks that often separates the people who go deep into the season from the people who don't make the playoffs.
This is one thing that I'm going to be talking about on my mailbag episode, which is dropping after this episode. So this is going to be somewhat redundant. But going back to the Christian Watson thing, one of the questions I got this week was about the downside of Christian Watson, right? And one of the things that I do think that people also need to think about here is when you think downside, also think about what you can do with the rest of your roster to help with that downside. And Christian Watson's a great example of that, where let's say you get him in the early 4th round, right? Which is where he generally goes, maybe mid 4th. But let's just say that you get him in the 4th round, and that's sort of the top of a pretty giant tier. I mean, you could argue that there's not a huge difference in terms of range of outcomes between, like, you know, a Christian Watson down to a Brandon Ayuk down to like a Jordan Addison type even, right? Like, I mean, a lot of these guys are similar in nature in terms of how they're, you know, Tyler Lockett, let's say. You know, a lot of these players are have a similar ceiling, have a similar outcome and outlook. And so usually you want to draft at the bottom of the tier instead of the top of the tier in terms of extracting the most value as possible. But one of the things that I talked about, and I will be talking about to people on that mailbag episode, is because you sort of have that insulation with these other wide receivers going in the 5th and the 6th round, like you can get a Brandon Cooks or someone who you know is very, very reliable and likely and has been a stud anytime that he's had a good quarterback that's throwing him the ball. You know, you can just go that route if you feel that scared and that concerned about going with Christian Watson. What you're really doing with a Christian Watson pick is you're looking at this profile and saying, this guy could burn the living you-know-what out of me if I don't pick him here, right? Yeah. Like this guy could ruin me.
Yeah, it was great. Evan Silva was on my show a few weeks ago, and we talked about DJ Moore, and he said he's my wide receiver 17, and it terrifies me.
Yeah.
He said I think, and we talked about the idea of doing some sort of roundtable with all the fantasy analysts of which players' ranking are you most scared of? Are you most scared? Like, yes, I'm standing by this ranking. We have to stand by rankings. That's what people pay us to do. Yeah. But when you look at it, you think, oh, boy, it's my, you know, sorry Joe could be just hanging out there whenever people start watching the games, and I said, don't take this guy or take this guy. And I think that with DJ Moore or with Christian Watson or all these guys, like you said, you can draft knowing that you're doing more of a boom bust risk reward pick, where, you know, we saw it with Darnell Mooney, we saw it with DJ Moore, where the downside is you might not trust this guy week to week, and if that really scares you that much, like you said, there are guys, and this is where we get to that best case scenario. There might be some players that you don't envision, Zay Jones, you don't envision better than a wide receiver 3 flex, but you feel pretty confident that they're going to settle somewhere around there, Tyler Boyd, right, and so on. You can take some of those guys later. Now, the counterpoint to that, I would say, is if you're doing good waiver wire moves, if you took good picks in the second half of your draft, if you make good trades, then having wide receiver 3 flex options to fill in for the picks that you shank early on, it's just going to be the residue of doing those things. So you don't need to draft thinking, well, I need to have at least one safe wide receiver. Because if you take DJ Chark and Rashid Shaheed and Rashee Rice, and you could even say, hey, take Rice and James and Valdez-Scantling, or you could do this shotgun approach, and it should yield one useful receiver.
You would think, yeah, right.
So, I mean, but I think you're right to bring up Rice. I think you're right to bring up Kansas City. And of course, I'd love Alfredo Brown says, are we just going to step on the rake of looking for a Kansas City wide receiver and just keep doing it over and over and over again? But that's the fun of it. And we know because of Kansas City's passing attack that, you know, that's what keeps us coming back. And we shouldn't assume that everything's going to go exactly the same way, although Patrick Mahomes did complete passes to 9 separate receivers in the preseason and a half. So yeah,
but look, again, it goes back to cost to acquire, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if Rashee Rice were going in the 6th or 7th round, I wouldn't be drafting him. You know, if you know, Sky Moore's been getting up there a little bit, but I think that he's the most like locked in player within
he
that
gets
offense.
the first shot.
Yeah. All things considered. So I think that they're all priced properly. And that's the thing, is that we don't have to necessarily see an outcome where one of those Kansas City Chief players ends up being the wide receiver, ends up being a wide receiver 2 in fantasy. It doesn't have to necessarily happen. We're just throwing darts based on probability, right? We're just, we're hoping that one of these guys could work out because we're associating them with the best young quarterback of all time. You know, I mean, it's a good bet to make. Now you're talking about range of outcomes and outliers here. One of the big storylines this season, in this fantasy season, is rookie tight ends. And so, we have Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, Luke Musgrave's getting a lot of steam. I built a tight end model this offseason for the first, it's like in beta mode still. And those 3 guys looked incredibly good, especially Laporta and Kincaid. But Luke Musgrave looked really good too, based simply on athleticism and that
2 games.
Yeah. And that meaning, exactly. And that meaning more, at tight end than it does at wide receiver and running back for fantasy purposes, right?
Yeah.
And so where are you at in drafting those guys? Because I've kind of bought into them this offseason. Like I'm kind of cool with getting a Laporta and Kincaid, especially if I know that waivers are going to be pretty fruitful and there's going to be a lot of decent enough tight ends that I could fall back on.
Yeah, well, to answer your question, we'll go back to our Apex draft, which I always do terribly in. It doesn't matter what strategy I do, I always do terribly. I took Sam Laporta in the 12th or 13th round, even though I think I took Kelsey.
Yeah, well, it's a lock that every year you're going to get Travis Kelce.
No matter what, I'm going to get Travis Kelce in the first round. So yeah, I think that they're worth taking, even if you take, and there are some interesting options at tight end. Darren Waller is an interesting option for sure. Coming off the summer, he's had David Njoku's had a great summer. Dallas Goedert's had a great summer. Still, I would take one of these rookie tight ends, and I think this is there's a theme emerging here, JJ, which you can never step in the same river twice, right? Like, backwards looking stuff, while it is a good starting point, is still looking at a different NFL than the one we're going to watch play out on the field this year. And rookie tight ends, especially one name you didn't mention is Michael Mayer. Though
Michael Mayer's another. Yeah.
He's banged up, although it still sounds like there's a pretty quick shortcut for him to pass Austin Hooper. It's also the Raiders. Really, I mean, is anybody optimistic about anything Raiders related this year? So, but you have now Michael Mayer is more of a two-way tight end.
Right.
Michael Mayer was drafted to be a classic two-way tight end. And if you try to go to the why behind rookie tight ends don't matter in fantasy, it's because they're learning 2 positions, basically. Right. They're learning offensive line and they're learning receiver, and it's just not going to happen. That's not these tight ends. Well, it's not Kincaid and Laporta. Kincaid especially. Kincaid was drafted for his receiving ability, period. And the good news with Kincaid is he's already getting some inline looks in one tight end sets. Now, Dawson Knox has been a little banged up, but it sure seems like the Bills are trying to find out, can we have him be our primary tight end? And also the offense obviously is supercharged. With Laporta, you have somebody who, as Thor Nystrom put it, love Thor, he said that without Sam Laporta, Iowa would have had one of the 5 worst Power 5 offenses in the last 25 years.
Wow.
Without Sam Laporta. And I believe him.
Yeah.
That, even though he was all Iowa's offense had, he still was productive. And in his case, he was the tight end 1 for his team, basically at the open of training camp.
Yeah.
And the Lions, who absolutely are a competition-based team, it's a bunch of former players as coaches.
Yeah.
He earned it. They said it. They just came right out and said, this guy already earned being the first team tight end. That should get your attention. And then with Luke Musgrave, it should also get your attention. He's maybe a little bit more of a two-way tight end, but there's that 2-game sample from last year that if he hadn't gotten hurt, would he have been the first tight end off the board in this draft? Right. I think athletic upside-wise, like you said, he's got that, maybe even more so than Kincaid and Laporta. So it's easy to tell a story where these guys blow this stuff up because they're not the typical first-round tight ends in terms of or early drafted tight ends in terms of why they were drafted so highly. And then just the leading data going into the season is that all of these guys are going to get as much work as they show they can handle.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked, historically, if you just look at routes run by these rookie tight ends, that's the biggest reason why rookie tight ends are not succeeding in fantasy football is because they're not out there. They're doing more, they're learning more than one position, as you said. They're not just out there playing slot receiver, right? And so if you look historically at the players who ran the most routes and ran a normal complement of routes, they're the players who actually did okay as rookie tight ends and were okay from a fantasy perspective. And I think that's a big, big plus for players like Laporta, definitely Kincaid, and then Musgrave. I do think has a little bit of juice there too. Just given that there's a lack of locked in alternatives in that offense in general.
And he's going to be on the field. What are they saying, JJ? Like 70-80% of the time.
Yeah,
I mean, he's
right.
going to be on the field as much as some of these grizzled vets are going to be on the field, and he's going to be working in the middle of the field. So it's going to be interesting to see. You bring up Christian Watson, the tension between, do you just keep Jordan Love throwing between the numbers? It's comfortable. A lot of Jaden Reed, another rookie, second-round rookie who's had a good summer, and Luke Musgrave in the middle of the field. Are we going to do more Dobbs, more Watson, dump offs to Aaron Jones? It's going to be interesting. I think that Green Bay's offense is a really tough one to project right now.
Yep.
And there's this lowercase o optimism. Not optimism like we got in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
But there's some optimism that at least Jordan Love looks functional.
Yeah.
But I've also heard it said if he was a rookie, you'd say, like, this is really promising. For a fourth-year quarterback, you're like, oh, okay, this will work.
Yeah. Yeah, and we don't have many examples of this, right? Like, we don't anymore, at least. Like, we don't have examples of he's like the Alexander Madison of quarterbacks, right? Where we can look historically and say, oh, these guys don't necessarily pan out because if they were good enough, they would have forced Aaron Rodgers out, or they would have et cetera. But I think that there's enough optimism surrounding Green Bay to invest in them in fantasy this year. One of the things with you being on the show, I feel like you're the perfect person to talk to about this, and that's vibes. I need to talk Jameson Williams. I was having this conversation with Matt Harmon at the Fantasy Football Expo, which was a great time. Anyone who's able to get there next year in Canton, it's really awesome to meet people and stuff. But I was talking to Matt Harmon, and we were walking somewhere, and I was saying that there are some players that just have horrible vibes associated with them, attached to them, right? And Jameson Williams, it just seems like one thing after another. And there's even some things that have been reported about Jameson Williams' behavior off the field that's not really mainstream reported. It's not really like coming from a Schefter account. A lot of the stuff with Williams is the suspension or the injury stuff, but there's been other like work ethic related things that have been reported. I'm not saying they're real or not, because I'm not, his mother. I'm not sitting there talking to him every day, but I do think
your next guest.
Yeah, next week I got Jameson Williams' mother. Yeah. But no, like I just think that there's some players where the vibes just look horrible. And I think, one of the things that was really that I got a lot of pushback for is that I have this year 2 model, right? I have the prospect model, and then the year 2 model looks at how well these guys are going to do in year 2 and year 3 based on their prospect score and how they did as prospects, and then based on how they did as rookies, right? So the inputs as rookies is more important than the inputs as they were in college, because we have an NFL sample at that point. Jameson Williams didn't have that much of a sample, obviously, last year because he barely played, and so his year 2 score looked like crap. It didn't look very good. But if you look historically at wide receivers who didn't do anything their rookie season, whether it be due to injury or not, the best example might be like a Mike Williams. It might be like a DJ Chark. These guys who aren't really these like staples, wide receiver 1 or 2 that you feel great about, whether from a dynasty perspective or a redraft perspective. And so when you add that to vibes, right?
Yeah.
I feel bad about Jameson Williams. I haven't drafted him. I just feel bad about him. And is there any merit to that? I need to ask you.
Yeah, no, yes, of course. I'll make the speech I've made many times on my show, which is intuition's not supernatural. It's not mystical. It's just all the knowledge, all the experience you have boiling itself down to a yum or yuck feeling, a gut feeling, if you will.
Yeah.
Warm and fuzzy vibes or not. And I think you're right that you can then start to investigate and look for data that shows us we're on the right track with Jameson Williams. And I think from the vibes point of view, from the narrative point of view, because I am the mayor of Narrative Street, and look, we're thinking about this in terms of a story. The chapters are being written, and stories change, stories twist and turn, but we can say, like you're doing with your models, JJ, well, the last 10 stories that started out like this, what was the next chapter?
Right.
Where did the story end up? And in the case of Jameson Williams, probably the most troubling thing that I've seen, JJ, is the team saying we want him to get as many reps as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's a second-year wide receiver. Contrast that with, Zay Flowers or Jordan Addison.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, for instance, when it comes to rookie wide receivers this year, and now I'm talking about more short-term, not long-term, but if you read what is being written about Jordan Addison, although KJ Osborne could still be the number 2 to start the season.
Yeah, we've been down this path before.
He's really cheap.
Yeah,
he's really cheap. I'm just
Yeah.
saying, like, for the first few weeks.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you. Yeah.
If you read about what's being said about Zay Flowers and you contrast that with what's being written about Quentin Johnston, there's a very different tenor and tone.
Yep.
Very, very different. Now, I mean, DJ Chark is a good example of a guy who looked like a bust. If you watched him in his rookie year, that's what a bust looks like in his rookie year. And then he came back in year 2 a different guy. So we always have to be open to that. But yeah, the vibes are bad around Jameson Williams because the team is telling us he's not where we want him to be. And he keeps creating obstacles for himself in injuries, in suspensions. And I think that, this is a point where we might say, well, what's the arbitrage play here? And you're looking at, hey, Sam Laporta, Jahmyr Gibbs, maybe even Marvin Jones or Josh Reynolds, or how about Amon-Ra St. Brown? How about Amon-Ra St. Brown catching over 100 balls and getting more balls downfield and turning some of those targets that he gets inside the 5 into touchdowns?
Not falling at the 1 yard line this season like 8 times. Yeah, exactly.
We know it's going to be efficient and productive, right? If Jameson Williams is not ready to be part of that, then maybe we're underestimating the other parts of that offense.
Yeah. I mean, again, I actually got a question too that's going to be on the mailbag about your gut feeling and your gut. Like, I think there's a lot of people, and this is one of the reasons I really wanted to do late round perspectives, is that so that people understand that I'm not just a robot spitting out numbers. I mean, we've known each other for years, but it's not a situation where I'm just clicking a button in a spreadsheet and then it's giving me these answers. I mean, there's a lot. These are puzzle pieces that we're putting together in order to formulate this masterpiece and hopefully be right with the way that we're predicting this stuff. And, I think it's important to at least have that perspective, if you will, that I am approaching things, in that way. And Jameson Williams, man, those vibes those vibes are rough. I want to ask you 2 more questions. One of them has to do with the Philadelphia backfield, because the Philadelphia backfield is one that has gotten a lot. I mean, there's just been a yo-yo, it feels like, within the fantasy space, within what beats are saying. Like, one beat reporter is saying something completely different from another, where one is saying that it's going to be Kenneth Gainwell, another saying, no, DeAndre Swift has been the guy all summer, and Rashad Penny's kind of just been in the background. There hasn't been as much, love for Penny. So where do you stand with that backfield? How do you think it's going to play out? Because obviously each of those players, I think Kenneth Gainwell is a good player. DeAndre Swift has shown flashes, obviously. Rashad Penny has been one of the most efficient running backs on the ground in NFL history, right? So we have really interesting players here. It's a good offense. It's an interesting situation. Where do you stand with the Philly backfield?
I think ADP has it about right, which is strange considering it's a backfield that the backfield as a whole was highly productive last year. That's even if you take off the Jalen Hurts touchdowns. However, how is it that one of the most productive backfields in the league has nobody going earlier than, hopefully DeAndre Swift's not going earlier than like the 8th round now, 8th or 9th round. How can that be? It's because it's going to be a 4-headed backfield. Remember those games last year where all 3 of the backs got a touchdown? Good. That's still successful if it's your flex play.
Right.
Not so much if it's your running back too. But I think that the additional projection to this, and this is why I've always been on Gainwell, and I don't think Gainwell's ADP. There are some players. I was talking about this with Scott Barrett earlier today. Like, a player can be rising in the preseason and still be a good value. They can be more expensive than they were a month ago and still be a good value. They haven't risen enough. And I was always on Gainwell because I just think that with respect to Swift, to talk about vibes, Swift and Penny, look. Maya Angelou, like, once someone shows us who they are, tells us who they are, like, we should believe them the first time. Well, how about the second time? How about the third time?
Yeah.
How's Rashad Penny's season going to go? DeAndre Swift, is he going to gain the trust of coaches? Is he going to perform consistent enough? Is he going to stay healthy? Either of these guys putting together a 15, 16, 17 game season is predicting a trend to reverse. And Kenneth Gainwell, while not outstanding, not playing like an all-pro, is dependable. He does what the team asks him to do. He can fit in a lot of different situations. He can fit in the 2-minute drill. He can fit in the goal line pack. He can do a lot of different things for this team and has done them at the very least well enough for them to keep putting more on his plate. I think to open the season, and then we're going to see who wins out between Boston Scott and Trey Sermon. A few writers have said it's not impossible that Rashad Penny's cut, but it's still like 98% he's going to make the team. Just keep that. I think Gainwell and Swift are the 2 guys that are 100% rock solid, write it in pen. But they're going to use all 4 backs. But JJ, come again, October, November, who's going to be healthy? Who's going to be dependable? who's going to be in the coach's good graces. I think all roads lead back to Gainwell. So I think the ADP should be more like Gainwell, Swift just based on talent, Penny just based on talent, and then of course have your waiver wire speed dial for whoever that fourth back is if these guys start to go down.
Yeah, I agree with you almost wholeheartedly there. The one thing with DeAndre Swift too, and this goes back to sort of what we were talking about with vibes and with looking at team actions and the things that they're doing through moves. I mean, I don't think that people should just ignore that DeAndre Swift was just completely and utterly replaced by a first round pick this year. You know, that they looked at DeAndre Swift. They not only limited his usage last season, you know, yeah, he was a little bit banged up, but not only limited his usage last season, but then went out this year on his rookie deal still. And they said, I'm done with you. We're going to trade you for peanuts over to Philadelphia. And oh, by the way, we're going to draft essentially a better version of you in the first round. I don't think that should be totally ignored and this is part of the reason why we've seen players when they move teams get traded, let's say, or get cut and move on. We remember the wins. We remember the Stephon Diggs, the AJ Brown, those players, but those are elite talents where there was some other stuff going on in terms of team building and just this off the field stuff. But like, and what they wanted and the direction of their individual offenses. But there are so many instances, way more, like 99% to 1% here, where players are leaving teams and they go to these new environments and they're leaving teams for a reason. Kenny Golladay, perfect example, right?
Yeah.
The Lions had a chance to keep Kenny Golladay around. They did not want to keep Kenny Golladay around, and they were 1,000,000% correct in doing that, right? And there's at least, and I'm not saying that this is the reason to fade DeAndre. I'm at market with DeAndre Swift right now, but I don't think that this should be ignored. I don't think that Detroit and the journey they went on with DeAndre Swift should just be totally trashed because he looks good on a per touch basis.
Yeah, Dalvin Cook, DeAndre Hopkins, right? I mean, these Leonard Fournette and Kareem Hunt still being out there, Ezekiel Elliott, and so on. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we take a stance and we say, is this team just wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And even though we just said the Lions might have shanked moving up in the first round for Jameson Williams, I don't want to bet against the Lions organization right now. I think they have a good handle on what they're doing. I think they know what personnel fit. I think they understand the 2023 NFL. Defense might take a little while to come along, though.
All right, I got one more question. You're in New Orleans. You're a New Orleans guy.
Yeah.
Give me. Speaking of vibes, I want to hear the vibes of the backfield there, because that is one of fantasy football's biggest question marks. Is the way that backfield might play out. Kendry Miller is all of a sudden healthy. A lot of people thought that wasn't going to happen until the regular season. He's healthy. Then you got Michael Thomas, who's seemingly healthy. Where are you at with that backfield, and where are you at with Michael Thomas? And do you think this is something I've been thinking about a little? I love Chris Olave. I think he's unbelievable. To me, he could have easily won Offensive Rookie of the Year last year. He was just as good as Garrett Wilson was, just that he wasn't in the same market, didn't have the same situation there. But are we undervaluing Michael Thomas's presence as it pertains to Chris Olave's ceiling in fantasy football? So I just want to get your general vibe check on this Saints offense.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Rashid Shaheed earlier. So the best I can tell about Michael Thomas has been the subject of controversy in the sense that you've got some reports, some longtime beat writers saying, he just doesn't have it anymore. You have others saying he looks better than he did last year. So I think, I don't remember who it was from the Saints, JJ, that said, well, we don't need old Michael Thomas. 75% or 80% of Michael Thomas will be just fine. Well, they're telling us. Yeah. They're just telling us, folks. Yeah. They're just telling us he's not old Michael Thomas. I would have put Michael Thomas in that tier with those boom bust guys we talked about earlier, Elijah Moore and Sky Moore and so on. I think he's out of that tier now. I think he's, a bye week injury emergency type replacement. I think he's probably going to be similar like Allen Robinson for the Steelers.
Okay.
A good, dependable veteran who on 3rd and 5, you need someone to make a tight quarters catch or a savvy play when the play breaks down, but he's not going to be a primary target for them anymore. So I think that then it's, and you know what's wild about that? That might actually be worse for Olave than if they thought he's going to be the guy and then he just goes out and he's probably going to bust his foot or something anyway. Because what you really have is Olave, I think, being projected with Michael Thomas not being that big of a factor in the offense. But if he's just an intermediate factor, now we get to some of that log jam that maybe keeps a George Pickens or a Deontay Johnson from really breaking out for fantasy this year that Allen Robinson represents, right? And then there's Rashid Shaheed, who's got the groin injury, but he's obviously the deep threat. And if you like stats like points per target or yards per target and things like that. He was off the
Oh
charts
yeah,
as an undrafted rookie.
Yeah, it's crazy. His yards per route. I mean, he's basically like the Chigakonkwo of wide receivers, where you know, his per route was unreal last year.
Yeah.
It's one of those situations where it's like, sure, I'm going to throw a dart. Like, what if he is really good?
Why
you know,
not?
Who knows?
What if he does get like 80 targets this year? That's like a 1,000-yard season based on last year.
Yeah.
We'll see. The backfield is to be determined, right? Kendre Miller got banged up, but right away when he got on the field in preseason was very impressive, including that catch that he made. And with Alvin Kamara suspended for 3 games, and I do think Kamara's offseason ranking assumed more like 4 to 6 games. So that was a win. If you were taking Kamara earlier in the offseason, that was a win. I think that there was an assumption of and I think Kamara's camp also felt like that was less than the team was bracing for and he was bracing for. But that's still 3 games. Miller is certainly the guy to draft ahead of Jamal Williams. They also drafted Darrell Williams. They brought, I think, Kareem Hunt in, and then he said, no, don't sign with them. Come and talk to us. Yeah. Don't sign there either. So I think that Miller's the guy who can at least become like a Mark Ingram to Kamara's Kamara. Kamara is interesting simply because of his track record. And because there's some talk that he's got some of his explosiveness back, you know, off-season program and things like that. So I'm not going to talk you out of taking him around the 8th or 9th round. Just know that Miller could be good enough in the first 3 games to make you wish you had him.
That's where I'm at with Kendre. He's someone who, you know, again, he didn't have the best like receiving profile coming out. He didn't really play that role in college, but he's also incredibly young. I mean, it was him and Izzy Abanikanda as the 21-year-olds coming out this past year. So there's some room for growth there, and there's been positive reports coming out that he's been catching the ball well in camp. So that's also a plus that he could potentially be that 3-down guy.
Yeah, and you know, we'll see. It's the Saints, because I think the whole thing hinges on Derek Carr. Because Derek Carr, how often, JJ, is there a quarterback that's like, yeah, I didn't play well last year?
Yeah,
I mean,
right,
just like,
right.
or no, he said something like, I didn't give my best.
Right.
Something to the effect of like, he was holding back, or he understood that he just wasn't engaged. And it's the Raiders, I understand. You know, Mark Davis is your boss. So if he now is more engaged and is just that guy who gets the low-hanging fruit and it executes an offense, like Garoppolo, his successor, now this pass offense was, and again, this is where you can appeal to the metrics and tell people, Andy Dalton was actually pretty good last year.
He was
surprisingly good last year.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're asking Derek Carr to take a step from that. The other thing I want to say, just as an aside, for your Superflex leagues out there, folks, doesn't Jameis Winston make sense as the quarterback that someone will trade like a 2nd-round pick for when their starter goes down?
Yeah, 100%.
A team that has playoff aspirations. He's
100%.
going to start at some point this year somewhere.
Yeah. I was hoping that he would get some sort of gig because he
loves it here.
Yeah, but he
belongs here.
Yeah, he is good for the game though, right? Like he's just good for football. He's super entertaining, and he's one of those people who's just, he doesn't mean to be funny, but he's hilarious.
No,
those are the best human beings to watch and to be around. So that's good stuff.
Oh, yeah.
All right, man. I really, really appreciate you being guest number 1 on Late Round Perspectives. Let everyone know where they can find you.
Yeah, Football Guys, Sigmund Bloom on Twitter. You know, I'm just happy to be part of. I'm honored, really, and it's just fun to see good things happen to good people, and also to know that all of your listeners, followers, they have good taste and they're discriminating, and it's fun. It's fun to have this journey. It's fun that we keep each other company as the football season unfolds, and I look forward to all of our interactions.
Thank you, Sig. Really, really appreciate it. I'm on Twitter at LateRoundQB or X, whatever you want to call it. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Hope you enjoyed the first episode of Late Round Perspectives. I got a mailbag dropping tomorrow. Definitely check that out. But as always, thanks for tuning in.